Good morning. Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator and Chair, for that very good introduction about myself. Yes, I did a lot of studies, but this will be my first research on Golan movement, especially in the Philippine environment. Now, before I would proceed to my presentation, let me express, in behalf of the Filipino delegation, our deep appreciation to the organizers of the International Symposium on Peace Building. It is indeed an honor to be part of this august body of scholars and practitioners. My presentation is entitled Turkey's Active Diplomacy in the Philippines as inspired by Fethullah Gulen. I hope I pronounced it correctly. When I said Turkey's active diplomacy, I am not simply referring to the normal official diplomatic engagement between the Philippine embassy and the Turkish embassy, but I am simply referring to the intercultural people-to-people diplomacy. So that throughout my presentation, I will not be touching on how the Turkish embassy or the Philippine embassy are doing well in order for them to strengthen the bilateral relations between the Philippines and Turkey. Now, to give you a brief introduction, from the time we signed our agreement in 1946, based on the a Treaty of Friendship until the mid-1990s, the Philippine-Turkish relation was considered to be, or thought to be friendly and problem-free. But one may notice that there was no significant improvement in terms of economic and cultural ties between these two countries. However, from mid-1990s, with the establishment of three institutions, the Golden Schools in Zamboanga and Manila, plus the Pacific Dialogue Foundation and the Turkish Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, this relationship has improved and new window of opportunity has been established between the Philippines and Turkey. To begin with my presentation, let me first present to you the three important questions which would guide us throughout my presentation. One is that how do the ideas of Fethullah Gulen motivate the movements, the current set of activism between Filipino and Turkish nationals? The second question is, what strategies are employed to promote Turkish interest in the Philippines and the Philippine interest in Turkey? And the last one is, what are the challenges and opportunities these activities encountered from 1995 towards the last month of 2012? Now, to give you a brief introduction of the Philippine-Turkish bilateral relation, from 1949 we signed the Treaty of Friendship, and in 1990 the Turkish government established embassy in Manila, and the following day in 1991, Philippine government established Filipino embassy in the Philippines. However, as I made mention before, there was no significant development of the trade and economic relations between these two countries. From mid-1990 onward, there were three institutions established in the Philippines, and these three institutions were guided or inspired by the ideas of Fethullah Gulen. Now, basically, there are 5,000 Filipinos in Turkey, and most of them are working as caregivers, and there are only more or less 200 Turkish nationals in the Philippines. And you can imagine how this 200 Turkish national has really contributed a lot to establish or to promote this so-called intercultural cooperation and inter-regional or intra-cultural cooperation. Now, as I made mention, I will not deal so much with the theoretical framework of my study. However, to give you the practical things, the strings of activities that the Turkish national has been conducting in the Philippines, has been initiating in the country. Now, these are the instruments being created to advance Philippine-Turkish relation. One was the establishment of the ICAD Foundation, by which under the ICAD Foundation, you have the Filipino-Turkish Tolerance Schools in Zamboanga. You have, under the school, we have elementary and high schools. And then we have the Fountain School in Metro Manila. We also have the Turkish Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines and the Pacific Dialogue Foundations in the Philippines. Now, before the 1995, if you can see from this illustration, this is the state of Turkish-Philippine relation, whereby you can only see two arrows, the bilateral relation between the Philippines and Turkey. Both countries were U.S. allies. However, both countries were conducting different foreign policy priorities. The Philippines has been engaged more in Arab countries in the Middle East, by which it tries to preserve three national interests, such as labor, the protection of Filipino labor, the supply of oil, and the crucial role of the Organization of Islamic Conference, whereas Turkey was focused more on advancing its interests and establishing ties with Western countries such as Europe and America. However, this very different orientation of foreign policy also put us in a limit on how to advance our bilateral relations. Now, to start with, let me quote this sentence or paragraph from Aslan Dugan and Seton in Gellen's Educational Paradigm in Thought and Practice, published in 2007, page 36. It says that a solution to every problem in this life ultimately depends on human beings. Education is the most effective vehicle regarding of whatever we have a paralyzed social and political system, or we have one that operates like clockwise. The first Turkish schools in the Philippines was established in Zamboanga, and Zamboanga is a very beautiful island. However, it is sad to say that this is also an island whereby conflict is always visiting the place. Now, to answer our first question, I borrowed the educational philosophy of Gelen from Robert Hunt and Yüksel Aslan Dogan, The Muslim Citizens of the Globalized World, pages 36-61, regarding education as the only lasting solution for society's problem and needs of humanity. And I will try to apply that on how Turkish educational institutions in the country operate. This is it. The Turkish schools in the Philippines, the schools are non-sectarian and do not follow any religious affiliations. Secular private schools and inspected by the Department of Education of the Republic of the Philippines. It follows scientific, state-prescribed curricula and international recognized program. And just recently, the Turkish school in Manila got accreditation from the Cambridge International School. And this is the characteristics of two schools in the Philippines. We have the Filipino-Turkish schools, and we have the Fountain International Schools. And if you notice that in the motto, it is service to humanity is being emphasized. Now, with regards to teachers' profile, Turkish schools in the Philippines would want to maintain this highest standard of education they can deliver to the students. And because of that, they tried to accept some teachers not just from Turkish nationality, but also from the US, from Britain, and China in order to maintain this so-called quality education, as Turkish schools in the Philippines are actually competing with various Filipino schools and international schools proliferating anywhere in the country. And as you can see here, that our graduates in these two schools, 30% of them went to local universities after graduation, 40% went to the University of the Philippines, the premier university in the country, and 30% of them went to the universities abroad. And these are the praises for Turkish schools in the Philippines, which would basically tells us that they really contribute to the promotion of dialogue between Filipinos and Turkish and between different groups in the Philippines. Okay, I am only given 3 minutes. Let's proceed. Now, the next institution is actually the Pacific Dialogue Foundation. It is considered as a cultural actor. Its primary focus is on establishing cultural understanding and has been initiator of the peaceful and productive dialogue between Filipinos of different groups and among Filipino-Turkish friends. So I'll just go on. These are the activities of the Pacific Dialogue Foundation in the Philippines. Interreligious dialogue or interfaith dialogue. And the third one is actually the establishment of the Turkish Chamber of Commerce. As you notice from here, that the Turkish Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines also coordinates with different institutions such as the Pacific Dialogue, ICAD, Philippine Embassy, Turkish Embassy, the Zamboanga School, and other confederation of businessmen and industrialists of Turkey. In short, this is the current state now of the Philippine-Turkish relation. We have the Galen-inspired schools coordinating with Pacific Dialogue Foundation and the Turkish Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, and then they are coordinating with the Philippine Embassy and Turkish Embassy, and in general, we have seen this strengthening of relation between the two countries. However, there are challenges that these institutions have faced. One is that Turkish schools' operation is limited in 2 areas. Civil strife continue to proliferate. Limited businessmen are involved in business matching. There is a need to promote Turkish products in the Philippines. More efforts are needed to encourage parents to send children to war-torn areas to schools. No enough intellectuals in the Philippines that are writing about Golan and Turkey and schools' competition with other existing schools in the Philippines. However, there are also opportunities. Promotion of education, that is the so-called fusing of various students from different backgrounds in conflict areas, whether you're Christians, Muslims, or whatever, they accepted them with an open arm. And we have also the tendency to promote harmony among students of diverse religious backgrounds. They offer an alternative, non-confrontational solution to peace building in Mindanao, and they strengthen resolve to intercultural dialogue and coexistence, and promote international Turkish language proficiency, increase business opportunity between the two countries, and the last one is the opportunity to introduce Philippines to Turkey and Turkish to the Philippines. Let me conclude my presentation by reading this one. In pursuing the idea of cultural dialogue and unselfish activism in the country, and by being true to the dedication of serving humanity through the promotion of universal values, regardless of skin color, religious and ethnic background, gender and political affiliations, the Turkish nationals in the Philippines, as inspired by the ideas of Galen, have been able to crucially perform the so-called middle way approach of bridging reasons, faith, religions, and cultural differences together to advance the process of eliminating the so-called ignorance and poverty in the long run. Hence, such has been reinforced by the so-called strategy of political avoidance, meaning to say that they have never sided with any political opposition in the country. Thank you so much for listening.